Now, if we turn our attention to something that, David, you will be very familiar with, given the summer, profit and sustainability rules, or PSR. Already I can see you giggling away because it has it's dominated this summer in terms of the transfer market. In fact, we saw that crazy day around the 30th of June, which ended up being PSR deadline day. It saw clubs such as Villa and Newcastle and Everton all involved and doing swap deals with each other. We saw a lot of homegrown talent leaving and going to other clubs, sometimes for fees that didn't seem to make too much sense. Just firstly, can you just explain to us, if you can, why this all came about and how it affected these clubs and why it was that it came to this deadline? Because surely they should have known about what was going on way before that.
Yeah, so the Premier League has always had some financial rules in place. Matt spoke earlier about their effectiveness. I don't think many clubs thought the Premier League would enforce them for a long time and they could get away with things. For right or for wrong, that was certainly a view among many clubs. And we didn't see anybody charged, really, to my memory, with financial breaches. But that appears to have changed with the Everton situation, maybe with the threat of the independent regulator from government. In recent times, we've had a system in place of aggregated losses. So you're allowed to lose a maximum of £105 million over a rolling 3-year period. Now, whatever your loss number is over that period, there are deductions that are permitted for stadium investment in youth and women's teams, and a certain number of other criteria. So Everton's loss was deemed to be over £300 million, but after the deductions, it was deemed to be £124.5 million, which was said to be £19.5 million over the permitted £105 million limit. They argued that, but were punished as we saw. Because it's a rolling cycle, their punishment, unfortunately for them, has remained within the cycle. It hasn't yet been eradicated, which led to a second charge. They've done so much work at Everton in terms of their recruitment activity under Kevin Thelwell and the leadership at the club to try and make sure that isn't going to happen in the future. Nottingham Forest came up from the Championship and they spent a huge amount of money that saw them in breach in the 3-year cycle, which confusingly overlaps the Championship, which is a different allowable loss, and the Premier League. They tried to argue that they waited on the sale of They tried to argue that they waited on the sale of Brennan Johnson to Tottenham to maximise his value. Unfortunately, they did it outside of the accounting period. It wasn't allowed within it, and so their argument was thrown out and they faced a punishment. What the other clubs have therefore seen is that the Premier League is ready to get tough, and those other clubs do not want to be in the same position. And so you could say that for quite some time now, that unofficial deadline of the 30th of June has always been there, but maybe clubs had their houses in order, or maybe it wasn't as serious a threat as it is now. I remember last year it was being talked about more and more in the industry, but it didn't really filter through into the public domain. However, this year it did. So suddenly we had the transfer deadline at the end of August, the transfer deadline at the end of January, and the PSR deadline on June the 30th. And it saw a scramble that I did feel was coming from my conversations with Premier League clubs. They knew they had holes to fill. Aston Villa were one of them. Newcastle were another one. Chelsea were convinced that they were compliant for this year, but that's another story altogether in how they became compliant with the, in the previous cycle, a sale of a couple of hotels on site. Now there's allegations or suggestions that they might have sold their women's team to parent company and so on. Manchester City and Arsenal, very little wiggle room to work with. And so, you had this remarkable situation where homegrown talent in particular, because they represent zero in the books and therefore on a sale, pure profit, were being sold by many of the clubs. Which is a debate in itself. Should football be allowing that or encouraging that? You saw all sorts of scenarios contemplated by the likes of Newcastle United. Maybe would Anthony Gordon be sold so soon after buying him to Liverpool, and players having something to think about out of the blue from nowhere all of a sudden. So it's created this sort of crazy rush to try to do business and to try to balance the books. You've seen Everton involved in that with some players between themselves and Aston Villa. A year ago, you saw Richarlison sold to Tottenham or a while ago for the same reasons. And so it's presented a new dynamic to the Premier League. I think a lot of people were, including us as journalists, breathing a sigh of relief when that June 30th deadline passed.
Was it one of the craziest weeks of your career?
It really was, because you've become so used to how the deadline works towards the end of August and the end of January. But this was a completely novel situation you found yourselves in, and you don't understand many of the rationales and reasoning as to why they're doing these sort of things, and it doesn't feel right. That's certainly something that I felt reporting on it. It not dirty, but just like, you know, it's making use of the system to do things that you wouldn't be doing in normal circumstances, and that didn't really sit well. The confusing thing in all of this is that the PSR rules are changing, and that's something we haven't mentioned yet. So from aggregated losses, they're going to go to squad cost control rules. And that means rather than you're allowed to lose this much money over a 3-year period, you're now going to be only allowed to lose a certain percentage, 85%, of the revenue that you make. And so that, in theory, allows you to lose more than you were in the past, but limits the amount that you're allowed to spend on player salaries, player transfers, and agents' fees, mainly.
And so how's that then policed then?
Yeah, so we await full detail, but the Premier League will hope to, I guess, Matt may know more, monitor this more in live time than they've been doing before. So instead of having your 3-year assessment period and you need to have your own house in order, and then you bring it to the Premier League and they punish you or approve you retrospectively, now I think it will be more keeping the Premier League's eyes on it as we go. I think that's the intention anyway. Whether the reality it pans out to be the same is a different matter. And then there's a third element, I'm really sorry, within all of this, which is going to be known as anchoring, where within that system of squad cost controls, which is going to be similar to what's going on with UEFA, they've already bought it in. The percentage of what you're allowed to lose is slightly different if you're in European competitions. And by the way, the English clubs in those European competitions will need to adhere to that. So that's a different percentage to the Premier League's rule. But there will also be something called anchoring, which is each club will only be allowed to will only be allowed to spend a certain multiple of the bottom club's revenue through, is it television?
Yeah,
income?
That's what they call central funds, which is basically television and prize money.
Yeah. So if the bottom club was Southampton, who earned £100 million, and the multiple was set for, 8 times that for the top club, and that was Manchester City, they would only be allowed to spend £800 million on their transfers and things. And so there is a lot of different accountancy mechanisms going on in the Premier League now. It confuses me and many others. It can be better explained by greater minds than me. The point that the Premier League are trying to enforce is that the Premier League remains competitive, that there's balance, that the teams at the bottom have as good a chance as anybody of beating the teams at the top, which they don't believe to be the case in other European competitions. And the ultimate aim is to make and retain the Premier League status as the best, the most watched, loved, and competitive division in world football.
Matt, just on that issue of fairness, because if we're seeing PSR not phased out, but obviously they are trying, as David said there, the squad cost rule and the anchoring as well. Would you see those systems, and actually particularly the anchoring, would you see that as more fair in terms of the way the competitiveness of the Premier League will be shown. Do you think those methods will be more fair for the clubs across the league?
It's fairer in a sense that it's more relevant to this moment in time. The current PSR limits were set 10 years ago, and there's a lot of frustration that the 105 million loss figure clearly has not been updated for inflation, both in the real world and in football, which is obviously run far ahead of the real world, as it always does. So the clubs will be given more leeway in the future. So that will be well received. I think it's important that it aligns largely with UEFA's regulations as well, because given the expansion of European competitions, we're now seeing 6, 7, 8 English clubs in Europe every year. So that's an improved position. In terms of the anchoring, the devil will be in the detail, as often the case. Obviously, the bigger clubs will push for a larger multiple. David mentioned 8. I think at the moment it will be between 5 and 6 times, which still gives Man City, Arsenal, ability to spend a huge amount more money than
because if
the
you
bottom.
look at, I think Man City's squad cost is something around 470 or close to 500. So surely if it's only 5 times, let's say it was Southampton, like David said, and let's say it was 105 million or whatever it is, that surely would still give City the wiggle room, if you want, to work with this. So how are they going to decide what the multiple becomes?
They're going to get in a room and argue about it and try and get 14 chairs and chief execs to agree. That's how it works in the Premier League. It's a members club. The Premier League doesn't really exist. There's an executive that enforce things and obviously a huge legal team, but basically the clubs themselves decide the rules, which is ironic given they've spent much of the last 3 years arguing about them and complaining about them after the fact.
Does it give you the feeling, like it does many of the public, even with these new rules, that it benefits the rich? The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That if you're allowed to spend a certain percentage of your revenue, well, Manchester United have the biggest revenue and they'll be able to way outspend somebody like an Aston Villa, who have really ambitious owners who want to spend, on Newcastle United, on paper the richest club in world football, but because their revenues are relatively small compared to Manchester United, they just can't spend that sort of money.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the rules as set up and as they will evolve favour the bigger, more established clubs. It's no coincidence that it's the medium-sized clubs and the sort of newly promoted ones that have had all the PSR problems. Everton, Forest, Leicester this season. Having said that, the impact is felt by the bigger clubs. Manchester United's spending has been restrained by PSR. They've just managed to manage the situation a bit better. They haven't breached. Arsenal and Tottenham, their spending has also been restricted because of fear of breaching. The really interesting one is Chelsea, really, because they haven't had any breaches yet, haven't been charged, but they've had to come up with some very creative ways to avoid that, which will create potentially more problems down the line. So the implications are felt by everyone, just in different ways.
Just on Manchester United, Stefan Borton, the football finance expert, was speaking on talkSPORT the other day about potential special allowances that Manchester United got that helped them get past PSR. And one of those was a COVID payment, he was saying, of 40 million, when compared to other clubs who are only receiving about 1 million around this stage. It was quite a shocking thing to hear, I'm sure, for fans of many other clubs. Why do you think it was that Manchester United were allowed these special allowances?
Well, all Premier League clubs, in fact all football clubs, were given allowances for COVID. The reason that figure, £40 million at United, has emerged is because they're a listed company, so it's in their accounts. We don't know what allowances other clubs were given. Everton, for example, were given huge allowances. They must have been to avoid being charged 2-3 years ago, because their losses for the 21-22 season were about £350 million and only 105's permitted. So quite clearly they were given what they call add-backs. for COVID. Eventually, in the subsequent years, they were charged. But unless we've got full transparency on every club's accounts, we don't really know. So I think it's sort of slightly mischievous to single out Manchester United in that way.
On AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.